And then from Matthew. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "Woe to you, blind guides who say, 'Whoever swears by the sanctuary is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the sanctuary is bound by the oath.' You blind fools, for which is greater, the God or the sanctuary that has made the gold sacred? And you say, 'Whoever swears by the altar is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on the altar is bound by the oath.' How blind you are! For which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred?" And the contemporary word this morning is from Prophets Are Radical and Traditionalists by Richard Rohr. The prophets were both radicals and traditionalists. They were radical believers in God and radical lovers of God's people. We can even say that they were radical traditionalists. Their penetrating insight saw into the heart of their own tradition, the tradition that went back to Yahweh's covenant with Israel, the tradition that went back further than their recent religious institutions. They reminded their people of God's faithfulness to that covenant, and they called them to be faithful to the God who gave it to them. The prophetic gift, or charism, is rare, I believe, because it demands two seemingly opposite things: radical traditionalism and shocking iconoclasm at the same time. Normally, we would think these two things would cancel each other out. Most people cannot imagine that both can exist, tame, and educate one another.
Now comes our invitation to transformation. I think that's what we hope for when we come to church, is that something will touch our hearts, that something will spark our imagination in a new way, that we'll meet a new friend, or that we'll understand something that seemed confusing before. That's that invitation to transformation. So our readings this morning, I find them a little bit ambiguous, especially that most famous line, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." In these few weeks, we're talking about the prophets, the biblical prophets, of which there were many, and we're talking about one in particular, the prophet Amos. Now, Amos lived in certainly between 750 and 760 BCE, because we know that because early in the book called Amos, it tells that he was the prophet during the reign of a certain king, and we know that king's reign. And this is a time when the people of ancient Israel are facing danger from the outside. The Assyrian Empire is going around and defeating different small countries around it to include them into that empire. And so people are trying to figure out what to do. How can we protect ourselves? How can we protect ourselves? They're not going to be able to do it militarily. But their understanding of God is that God protects them. Now that's an interesting one right there, isn't it? What's our understanding of God? Some thought that they couldn't be defeated because God was their God. And the prophet Amos was saying, my costume. The prophet Amos was saying that's not so. That, in fact, God sometimes uses other peoples, other armies, to punish us for our wrongdoing. Another thing that we would think about differently today. But the people of that time, the Israelites of that time, had a series of big festivals every year. Some of them we still know about today. The Jewish people celebrate them all still, but we hear about, for example, Passover, which happens in the spring around our Easter time. They had the Feast of Weeks, which we celebrate as Pentecost. These big festivals, people all gathered together at the central temple, where they would have special services and they would make special sacrifices. Now, it was a practice in that time for many peoples, and it is still to this day practice of some peoples, to sacrifice an animal to God as a way of demonstrating their commitment to their tradition. And at the Hebrew temples, they would roast that meat, and then the priests would eat it. And if it was Passover, everybody got some. So this passage here, if you don't have that understanding of the people that Amos was speaking to, it's hard to make sense of our passage today. One of the things that we said about the prophets last week is that the prophets, if we think of an ancient prophet, I think I demonstrated with my hair last week, if we think about ancient prophets, we think of them as wild-haired, stomping around, declaring extreme outcomes, punishing, that God would punish the people and so on. Of course, there's much more to them than that. Those are the parts that stick in our minds, wonder why. But those are the parts that stick in our minds generally. A book that we're reading together in the Friday discussion group by Richard Rohr, the same author as our contemporary reading today, talks about the prophets and says that image of the prophets as thundering punishment is only one aspect of them, because they also have a phase they go through or a time they go through where they are just mourning what is happening to the people, to the animals, to the land, to the whole community. So prophets judge, they thunder, and they mourn. But as they mature into their later lives, they seem to come to a time of acceptance, a time of peace, where they recognize, yes, judgment comes. Things are wrong. Things are still wrong in the community. And yes, I am still mourning all that we have lost. And yet, I also can remember my deep trust in God, my deep trust that our tradition teaches us the ways that God would have us live, and that as individuals and communities, we can continue to strive for that. So here we have Amos. And the first part of our reading from Amos, seek good and not evil so that you may live. Then I hate and despise your festivals. These are the festivals that Amos is talking about. And here in this passage, Amos is speaking as if he were the voice of God. So this is imagining that God says, I hate, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. For those of you who like to hear about Hebrew language, there's a couple of fun things in these little phrases. For example, you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. The word there, yes, it means accept, but it also means smell them. God is not willing to come down and inhale that delicious aroma of roasting meat. I will not look upon your offerings of fatted animals. So he's not going to smell what's going on there. He's not going to look at it. And I'll take away the noise. He's not going to listen. God, this God, as they are imagining God here, has a body like ours. Now, for us in the 21st century, sometimes when we imagine God in our minds, we imagine someone like a human figure. But sometimes we imagine God as something much greater than the equivalent of a human figure, something that imbues the whole universe, something that generates the energy, the inspiration, the love that we know as God. So when we hear that phrase, God is love, we're imagining this whole essence that imbues everything. But this image of God that we have today is an image of God with a body. And we come to this last line here. And you may remember this line, but let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This is one phrase from the Bible that Martin Luther King Jr. used many times in his speeches and in his sermons. If you've heard his talk from the March on Washington in 1963, he uses it there. He did make one change, and this is fun too. So we read modern translations of the Bible here. These are based on the best scholarship we have of what that ancient Hebrew language actually said. But the King James Version, which would have been the translation that Martin Luther King grew up with, that was translated in 1600s. So it was an old translation. And they translated it not as ever-flowing stream, but mighty stream. So I think that's an interesting thing, because often when I think of this phrase, I hear it in Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice, and I hear that mighty stream. But the Hebrew here actually means ever-flowing. And it makes sense when we remember that the Israelites lived in a region with a climate like ours here in California. There was not rain in the summer. And their streams, many of them, would dry up. And so the idea of an ever-flowing stream is the idea of the continual availability of fresh water. Well, that phrase in Hebrew is just 6 words. We have to use, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 14 words to say this. But in Hebrew, only 6 words. And those words, some of them rhyme, they have a rhythm to them. It's poetry. And so for us to remember that these passages are in an ancient kind of poetry helps us to remember that they contain not only descriptions of what is seen and heard, but metaphor. And metaphor is very important here because all of a sudden we jump from these festivals, events, places that people knew, and we jump into justice and righteousness. We can't see or touch or taste or smell justice and righteousness, but here they are. And this justice and this righteousness, these are the themes of most of the book of Amos. And it is a justice that says that people will be treated fairly. It's a justice that says we care for people who are poor. We visit people in prisons. We take care of the sick. We welcome immigrants and aliens because these are the traditional justice themes of the Israelite people. So when we say let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, we're saying Let's have justice everywhere. Let's live according to the teachings we believe in. This is something that's very hard for people all over the world right now, where there are political struggles between people who have a lot and want to keep it, and people who have very little and struggle for existence. And so this is saying, this is how it should be. Everyone should have the food they need, the shelter they need, the medical care they need. Everyone should be welcomed and cared for. When we think, for example, about aliens, refugees, immigrants in this time, because of the climate, there were periodic droughts. And in those times, if you were living in an area that was suffering a drought, you had to go to another country, another place, in order to get the food you needed, the water you needed. And so when people came to you and you had food and water, it was your obligation to share with them. I've been talking a long time here, so I just want to say a couple more things here. We think we know what that phrase about justice and righteousness means, but actually, in the Hebrew poetry, it's actually a little bit more ambiguous. Not clear to us. But in the Hebrew, it might be that God is saying, my justice, I am going to release my justice like a torrent of water. My righteousness will be forever. And this is interpreted by some as that God is coming with great punishment for the people who have not been living according to their understanding of what was right. We struggle with this image of God that when difficult things happen to us, that it might be a punishment from God, because it doesn't fit our understanding of God as we understand it in our own tradition today. When we understand God as love, as a God of love for each person, each animal, each plant and tree, when we understand God that way, we don't understand God as one who would send one group of people to fight another. And yet we sometimes hear people say that they think that God has sent them to do what they are doing. In our tradition, in our contemporary Christian tradition, God does not send people to abuse other people. That is not God initiating that action. No. It is someone or some people who have been directed away from living in what we would call a just and righteous way. So many of us are struggling in this time with the political news that we hear or the images we see of things on TV. It is not an easy time. But it is a time to ask ourselves, how does our tradition call us to live in this moment? Is it calling something extra from us? Just one example of something that I've been thinking about. I understand that very soon what are called SNAP benefits, which is money for food, which is given to people of low and moderate incomes by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that money is being cut off. So we will have millions of people who do not have access to the money for food that they rely on. Part of our obligation is to say, let us restore the practices that we have that allow us to ensure that people have food. Let us restore those benefits. But is perhaps part of our call also to say, How can we contribute to local efforts or even regional or national efforts to help people get through this time? Are there places where we can contribute money that will go to people who need it for food? So these are ways that I think these passages speak to our current situation. And there's one more thing I wanted to ask myself and invite us to ask ourselves, and that is, what do we think we are doing here when we come on Sunday morning? Obviously, our practices of what we call a service or what we call worship are not the same as the ancient Israelites. And yet we come here because we are seeking some connection with that holy love that we believe permeates everything. And sometimes it's easier to find that among other people. Sometimes it's easier to find it with another person. When you get to talk deeply with someone and look them in the eyes, we get a momentary glimpse of that power of love. Sometimes we sing a song and it lifts our hearts. We get a momentary glimpse. But we're a small enough community. Obviously, we're missing 5 or 6 people here today and a couple people online, but we're a small enough community that we can talk about this. We can say, how can our services, how can our Sunday morning times really speak to us from our tradition to where we are now? So I'm trying to think about that. Yeah. Well, I'm going to go back to those beautiful, ambiguous words, because I think this is the kind of thing that I'll carry in my heart during the week. Let justice roll down like water, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Let justice roll down like water, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Amen.